Ladies and gentlemen, we have got maybe the craziest stadium news to drop in Australia, and it does involve our biggest and most famous stadium worldwide. It is the Melbourne Cricket Ground, of course, the mighty MCG, and a new $15 million business case that has been put together by the MCC and the MCG Trust in conjunction with the Victorian government. And they are looking at what is the future of the MCG. What does that look like, especially with the next stage of the renovation to the ground? And potentially how do we keep the stadium going for another 100 years, as it has done in the past 150 or so years? And they have come out and said that a plan to put a roof on the MCG, first floated by Eddie Maguire a few years ago, they're saying that could cost up to $6 billion to retrofit a roof to the MCG. Now, it does seem crazy, but you do think of what that could mean for cricket, obviously with rain delays and things like that. Could you attract more concerts, big entertainment events that would normally be hosted in indoor arenas? Could you have it at the MCG and take advantage of the 100k plus capacity? It has been talked about for a few years, but they are saying this plan would cost up to $6 billion. It would include, of course, a full knockdown and rebuild of the Shane Warne stand, formerly known as the Great Southern Stand. That stand built all the way back in 1992. It is over 30 years old now, and probably 40 years old by the time they really start thinking about putting a major renovation in place to the MCG. But the preliminary costings of $6 billion aren't really seen as achievable and realistic. We do have the president of the MCC, Stuart Fox, coming out and saying any renovation needs to come up with a sensible plan because, of course, it has to be funded and delivered at some stage in the future. Quote, if we overscope it, a roof might cost $5 or $6 billion alone to retrofit, and that's not even going into a potential rebuild of the Great Southern Stand. He also said that the MCG dropped out of the top 10 biggest stadiums in the world last year, and they do want to see it back into the top 10. Currently, it is apparently the 11th biggest stadium in the world, and Fox is saying there is at least 10 to 12 events every year where ticket demand is such that we could have a higher capacity. Of course, we're in the middle of the AFL finals. We do have the grand final coming up on Saturday, of course. No doubt you could sell 200,000 or 300,000 tickets to that if there was a stadium big enough. We also saw two big sold out prelim finals, well over 95,000 to each of them, and we have just seen the AFL finals getting bigger and bigger every year, to where the MCG's current capacity is really constraining the ability to sell as many tickets as possible to some of those bigger events. Of course, you also have the big concerts, the Taylor Swifts, you have the soccer exhibition games, some Socceroos games, State of Origin Rugby League occasionally, International Rugby Union as well. There is the World Cup coming up in 2027. So potentially there is demand for a bigger stadium in Melbourne, and of course that would be a renovation to the MCG instead of a brand new stadium. So the MCC's come out and said although it would cost $6 billion, it is unlikely that will go ahead with a roof. Of course, a roof, as we've seen with Tasmania, does cause some issues in terms of the costings. There is also a question mark about Test cricket, to where the ICC would need to change the rules to allow Test cricket to be played inside. And of course, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, you have to make sure it is capable of hosting cricket in the future, given that is one of the key aspects of the ground, the history of Test cricket being played there. They're also saying it would bring a lot of tourism dollars into the state of Victoria, with over 620,000 visitors to Victoria from interstate and overseas, and $290 million spent in Victoria for tourism involving events at the MCG. And it's also saying that the current Shane Warne stand is really reaching its use-by date. It was built all the way back in 1992 for the Cricket World Cup. So right now the stand is 33 years old. It is a little bit behind the times in terms of the infrastructure, escalators, lifts, amenities, bars, restaurants, things like that. Of course, corporate facilities. The more corporate tickets you can sell, they do produce a higher yield in terms of revenue, and it is very beneficial for events being played at the G when you do have those high value corporate tickets available. But the main story is, even without a roof, there is going to be a major renovation to the MCG, probably at some stage in the next 10 years. It is going to involve a full knockdown and rebuild of the Shane Warne stand, and you would say that would involve some sort of increased capacity. When you look at the MCG, you can see that the northern part of the ground, which is the newer part of the ground rebuilt in the early 2000s for the 2006 Commonwealth Games, it is a lot higher in terms of the elevation, and it is a bit more modern in terms of the amenities and the comfort of the patrons. So you'd think they'd try to build the new Great Southern Stand in that sort of design to where the stadium looks more symmetrical. It does look more or less the same all the way around, and they would try and make the height of the grandstands and the roof match the northern part of the ground, which is the Ponsford Stand, the Olympic Stand, and the MCC members. Apparently the estimated cost of that is around $1 billion. That was back in 2022 when that number was come up with, so quite possibly you'd be looking at about 1.5 if it was repriced in 2025. They're also saying that would add around 5,000 seats to the capacity, so you'd be looking at around 105,000 capacity stadium. Potentially they could look at going a little above that, getting it up to 110, 115 for those bigger events, but then you have the issue where the smaller events, the regular AFL games, and some of those other events really not filling out the stadium, and it does give it the effect to where it's a lot more cavernous and sort of empty to what it is now. But it is clear that the MCC and the MCG Trust, as well as the Victorian State Government, are serious about this. They've spent $15 million on the business case, so clearly you would expect something to be locked in maybe in the next couple of years, and maybe construction starting on that in around 2030, you would have thought. Andrew Dillon, the AFL CEO, has also come out and said that we may have to move the AFL Grand Final interstate. Through the years, the MCG is being renovated. In the last renovation in around 2003 to 2005, they did keep the MCG as the host of the Grand Final. I think the capacity then was at its lowest around 77k for the 2004 Grand Final. So still a decent capacity and bigger than pretty much any other stadium in Australia, apart from the Olympic Stadium in Sydney. But Dillon has come out and said, well, we saw the 2020 and 21 Grand Finals played in Brisbane and Perth. Obviously, due to the pandemic, he said that was a great success. And he's also very happy that the government and the MCC are putting the money in to look at the revamp of the Shane Warne stand. They're really keen to obviously be able to sell more tickets, get a bigger capacity in for those bigger games. And he's also come out and said, I'd rather the renovation be done in one go rather than staggering it over a number of years. And he said that the Perth and Brisbane Grand Finals worked really well. And while there's something special about the MCG, they have to make sure that the G remains the preeminent stadium worldwide. And after the sold out prelim finals, he's saying if we can get another 5,000 or so into the MCG, that would be great. The MCC boss, Stuart Fox, also saying there's probably another 3 years ahead of us in terms of the study to understand what needs to go into the stadium. So probably they'll be locking in something in around 2028, 2029, and you'd expect to see works being complete in the early 2030s. And by that point, obviously the entire stadium would have been effectively renovated in the past 25 or 30 years. It will just make it a more modern and comfortable stadium by world standards. And obviously any increase in capacity will be appreciated by the AFL and also the government due to being able to attract bigger and better events to the ground. So it will be really interesting to see what happens with this. I don't think the roof is really a starter, although it is an interesting concept. It does go to show how expensive roofs are. You don't really see them retrofitted onto existing stadiums much around the world. We did have the plan to install a roof on the Accor Stadium in Sydney, of course the Olympic Stadium, but those plans ultimately were scrapped. And especially the MCG, when you look at it, it was built over a number of different years, so you don't really have that common design to where it would be easy to put a roof on. So the amount of money you'd have to spend, 5 or 6 billion, it does really get ridiculous. And even if we look at SoFi Stadium in LA, that is currently the most expensive stadium ever built. That was around $5 billion from scratch. It does have a roof, but if you're willing to spend that much money, well, you might just ask the question, why don't we bulldoze the MCG and start again? Either way, I don't think that's going to happen. They do already have Marvel Stadium in Melbourne, which has a roof. It is perfectly fine for some of those smaller AFL games and a number of other sports and concerts and things to that effect. And then you keep the MCG as the Coliseum Coliseum as the biggest stadium in Australia, and it will continue to host AFL Grand Finals, Boxing Day tests, etc. going forward. Either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. It is a really interesting concept, and it is exciting that there is going to be a bit of money spent on our most famous ground over the next decade or so just to bring it into the 21st century. That's all we're going to have time for today, guys. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more.